Sorry about that. I had to adjust my lighting.
Jaylene?
Yes.
Patrice has just texted me and asked if you could send her an invite to her
I
personal.
had to adjust my lighting.
Oh, to her personal email. Yep, you bet. I'll do that right now.
Okay.
Okay, so Lyle's in. Erica, Heather participates. Can anybody hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Yep.
All right. Sorry about that. I had a little kerfuffle getting here. Is everybody waiting for me?
No, I think we're just waiting for Jaylene to log in Patrice and then maybe start the video.
Okay, good.
The video is, we're actually streaming right now. So I have sent the email to Patrice to her other email, and we should be good to start relatively quickly here. I don't believe we're waiting for anybody else. So if you want to proceed, Madam Chair.
Okay. All right, so we'll call this meeting to order. It's 1:06 on June 11th. And I'll call the meeting to order. And the agenda, is there any amendments? And if not, can we adopt the agenda as presented? Sorry, just give me a sec here. Okay, someone move that we approve the agenda as presented. Heather? Okay. The next item is the update. Who's giving the update today?
For council?
Yes.
Oh, I guess that's me since Morgan's not here. Oh my gosh, I didn't really prepare anything, so let me think. We had council, we got a presentation about Colt, which was great. Lots of good things going on with that. I got my brains kind of numb. I've been in, this is like my 4th meeting this week. So you know what, can I come back to this? Can we skip it and I can come back and make some notes? Because honestly, I wasn't really prepared to give an update. I thought this was just like us giving our information on Western Heritage Design, not actually a CPC meeting where I had to do an update.
Okay, absolutely. Okay, moving on, we'll go to development permit 2020-059.
All right. All right, I may need a little here how to
Can I-
share this PowerPoint presentation.
Can I ask a quick question? I thought this was just input on Western Heritage Design and not necessarily like a full CPC meeting. Am I missing something? Because that's exactly what I thought it was.
Yeah, well, the parking lot with the variance to landscaping was added on to this agenda, but it is the only development permit that was added on to the CPC meeting.
Oh, okay, I must have missed that, but yeah, I just assumed that it was just Western Heritage Design stuff, not actually like meeting stuff. So, okay, anyways, proceed, sorry.
So Adam, would you mind helping me again how to share the screen for the PowerPoint presentation?
It should be right at the bottom there,
On
the
share-
big green button.
It's
Yeah.
Ryan speaking. Jaylene, did you enable sharing as the host?
Yeah, my thing says host disabled attendee screen sharing.
Okay, try that now, Danica. I don't think I disabled it, but it automatically starts disabled. So I think I
Yeah.
fixed it.
That's true. Yeah, you have to enable it. Danica, the
Just
button.
in the effort to save time here, if we've all read that report and we're struggling to get it up, do we really need Danica to read it out? I think everybody should have seen the report, read through it. Looks pretty simple. Do we really need to go through all the steps of her having to read it?
Yeah, I think we probably should, Lyle.
All right, sure. Yep, you bet.
Okay, so I just need to figure out how to share the screen here. Now, Adam, do I need to drag that somewhere? Sorry, I know it's a PowerPoint here.
There should be a share screen at the bottom of the screen.
Yeah,
Danica?
yeah, I did click that.
Okay.
And then it comes up, it says basic, advanced, or file files maybe you need to go to.
Do you have it open on your computer?
Just go basic. You should be able to select either the screen or the window itself if you have it open.
Okay, it's open.
Okay, so if it's open and then you go to share screen, it should come up as an option.
Oh, here we go. Yeah. You betcha. Thank you for your help.
You're welcome.
Okay. I think we're there. You're sharing the screen. You guys can see that okay?
Yes, we
Yes,
can.
it's good.
Okay, awesome. And then how do I get to the PowerPoint?
So just go to slideshow,
Slideshow.
one over from the gallery. There you go.
There we go. Perfect. We're good to go. All right. So this afternoon, good evening, Madam Chair and members of the Cochrane Planning Commission. Got two computers going here in all of this, so just bear with me. The application is being presented for a parking lot with variance to landscaping listed as a discretionary use in the Central Business District, located at Lot 10, Block 2, Plan 001-1685, civically known as 403 Railway Street West. The parking lot proposed is part of a larger project the town is working on with the Transit Hub Center, which will be located to the north of Railway at 360 Railway Street. Due to the pandemic and the financial impacts on the future tenants and the town, the Transit Hub is being reevaluated on how to move this project forward. In the meantime, the capital projects for Railway Street are moving forward with a start date of construction in the summer of 2020. In order to mitigate extra construction costs, the town is looking to incorporate the parking lot construction with the capital improvements along Railway Street. Due to the Transit Hub and parking lot not being presented for a decision in its entirety, planning requested a new development permit for the parking lot only. The parking lot development permit was reviewed against policies like the Downtown Area Redevelopment Plan and the Downtown Area Action Plan. The parking lot meets the goals, objectives, and policies to ensure there is an adequate supply of parking within the downtown, but does not have a detrimental effect on the development or redevelopment of the downtown. The plan also supports on-site landscaping to be used as screening to soften views of parking areas from adjacent roadways and uses, which the application adheres to. The parking lot will support the future transit hub development. The CP rail pedestrian crossing will support the redevelopment and link to the north and south downtown areas as proposed in a future capital project. The parking lot provides accessibility to the downtown, while the landscaping along Grand Avenue and Railway provide the visual screening and buffering, creating a sense of place. The parking lot complies with the 1.5 minimum setback from the front and side property line. It meets the land use design standards and provides adequate landscaping to screen the parking area, even though a 1% variance is required. The enhanced landscaping along Railway Street and Grand Avenue provide the most value to the community while providing sufficient parking for future users. Access to the parking lot will be shared through the library through the shared access road. Landscaping is focused along Railway Street and Grand Avenue, shown in the landscaping plan. On-site lighting includes 2 double head lights on site. Lighting currently exists along Grand Avenue. The parking lot is designed for stalls to have power and charging stations on site. At this time, the details have not been worked out regarding the power for parking stalls, but the electrical drawings have been prepared and are awaiting the town's consideration. Administration is in support of the parking lot with variance to landscaping as it meets the parking lot special requirements in section 2151, meets the design standards as per section 1137, meets the number of trees and shrubs for the landscaping as per section 1127.1. Therefore, planning is recommending option 1 that Cochrane Planning Commission approve DP 2020-059 for parking lot with variance to landscaping on lands legally described as Lot 10, Block 2, Plan 001-1685, known as 403 Railway Street, subject to the following conditions in your report. That concludes my presentation. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Danica. If you could close your screen.
Yeah.
So can I see the chat box? Okay, so we have the chat box open. Does anybody have any questions or comments with respect to this development permit? No? Okay, that being the case, can I have a motion, please?
I move that we accept development permit 2020-059 with the attached conditions.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Balmer. Any discussion, comments?
So was that for option 1 then?
Oh, that was option 1, I take it?
Lyle, you're muted.
Yeah, it is for option 1.
Thank you.
Okay. Okay, no questions, no comments. That being the case, and we go to a vote. All in favor
Yes.
and opposed? Erica, are you in favor?
I said yes.
Oh, okay. I just can't see you because of your picture. Okay.
Yeah.
So yes, all in favor and no one's opposed. So it's unanimous. Patrice?
Yes, good, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. So the next item is the workshop. And so it is a presentation on the Western Heritage Guidelines and give us key updates with the framework and give us an opportunity to ask a number of questions, why the guidelines are being used in the scope of the new framework, and to go into more depth some of the key concepts that are being proposed. And so I think we can move ahead. Adam, you may be muted. I cannot hear you myself.
Hello, can everyone hear me now?
Yes.
All right, excellent. So thank you for agreeing to meet with us. I wanted to make sure that we had time to discuss this matter at a bit more length. So that's why we requested this special meeting instead of having it as part of our regular meeting this month. So we will be, so I have a presentation prepared, and I'm also joined by my the consultants from ERA, Emma Abramowitz and Shelley Ledman. They've been working closely with us on this project, and we're now giving you an update about where we're at, what the framework's looking like, and what are the key changes that are coming.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
So we are going to start by reviewing 5 sections just to review the outline and contents of this new framework and make sure we're all on the same page as we discuss some of the new concepts that are going to be introduced later. The first, we're going to talk about what is Western heritage. And from our public consultation, we understand that this is a concept that exists to help communicate Cochrane's identity as a unique place. We've divided this concept into 2. One where it's intended for locals who ask us for the conservation of Cochrane's special qualities and historic identity. But there's also Western heritage as a concept for visitors, which identify it as a brand or what makes Cochrane a unique place to visit and spend time. In our old guidelines, Western heritage was portrayed as an architectural style. Well, the idea being that locals would see their heritage carried out through this boomtown era architecture in the built environment. These existing guidelines ask for architectural features on contemporary construction, like parapets and gooseneck lighting, as you can see on the photo on the right. However, some of the 2020 revisions are premised on the idea that this is not the only way or the most effective way to communicate Cochrane's identity. So why are the guidelines being revised? So there's a couple key reasons that are driving this review. First, we want to make sure that the direction to property owners, business owners, and developers are clear and applied consistently throughout the town. We've had multiple experiences where if we're making a request to the development and business community that they don't accept as legitimate, there'll be significant pushback. It's hard for us to rationalize why these guidelines have these requirements. And sometimes we find that we are bending the rules on certain sites, which undermines the entire legitimacy of these guidelines. Most of these cases come up when we're dealing with businesses and buildings that don't traditionally fit in our historic town context. So a popular one is when we're dealing with car dealerships. Their building form doesn't necessarily meet anything in the previous guidelines would support. And we're also going against what their brand requires for their building. We also want to emphasize and confirm that responsibility for communicating Western heritage is shared by both public and private sector actors. The current guidelines ask a lot of the private sector property owners and developers, and predominantly give them the responsibility of communicating Western heritage. When in reality, Western heritage is something the town should be delivering to the public and is most effective in public spaces, such as parks and squares. And we're looking at ways to diversify who's delivering this Western heritage and how it's being communicated to the public. The third reason is we want to make sure that the framework is also based on best practices in heritage conservation. If the goal of Western heritage is to communicate Cochrane's history and identity, there are more appropriate and less appropriate ways to do this. And they have been outlined in provincial, federal, and even international best practices. And there's no reason why our approach shouldn't be in line with these standards. Finally, we want to make sure that we're fostering the potential for new eras of architectural excellence. We believe that there is great value in the architecture of Cochrane's early settlement era, but there are other high quality architects and contemporary design approaches that could contribute equally to our built environment. And the concern is if we continue asking for buildings to be designed in a very strict parameter, we'll be inhibiting potential high quality expression in our town. So how are these guidelines being revised? We're looking at 3 key areas. We're reviewing the concept of Western heritage in the town, as well as the way design direction is provided. And finally, we're looking at the zones where we're going to be asking for Western heritage. To start, where before we were talking about Western heritage as an architectural style, we were broadening to think about this as Western heritage as a sum of Cochrane's history and small town character. So this won't just include our early settler history and its relationship with boomtown style architecture, but also railway history, early industries that shaped Cochrane, the First Nation history along the Bow River, the major intercommunity transportation routes, and other historic scenes that are important to Cochrane. The new framework will ensure that we recognize that we're asking for the communication of heritage, that this is about story and not just about architecture. We're doing this by revising the way direction is provided. The existing guidelines were very detailed for new construction, and property owners were required to follow them. However, in the revised framework, we're providing a 2-tiered structure where there are mandatory high-level design objectives that will set the greater intent for the built environment, and non-mandatory supportive design guidelines to help each objective and help users understand what we're asking for. For example, we have new construction will contribute to the variation in small-scale, close-knit building forms that conveys the quality of Cochrane's history and small-town character. And this will be supported by a guideline, such as new buildings should choose from a variety of roof forms found in the historic town, including flat and pitched roofs. Whereas before we mandated the exact roof types, we're now looking at guidelines that will, again, reinforce that it needs to follow existing roof forms, but it still has enough flexibility for a different approach or a more creative approach should the applicant come forward. And this is a key reason why we're revising these from being Western Heritage Design Guidelines to a Western Heritage Design Framework, as a new structure creates a framework for the implementation of Western Heritage with high-level strategic direction provided by objectives, as well as detailed guidance and assistance provided by the guidelines. Ooh, I'm a little ahead of myself. We also looked at the zone of implementation, and where our old guidelines had 6 distinct areas with design direction in each. The framework will simplify it into 3 priority areas. So these areas are the historic town, which is highlighted in yellow on the map, and compromises of our full early settlement area town site of Cochrane. We also looked at the railway transition zone, which is highlighted in blue. And this follows the railway as a historic character defining element of Cochrane and the downtown. And this will help transition the historic town into contemporary urban areas. And finally, we looked at Cochrane's corridors along highways 1A and 22. And while there is not much historic character in these areas, they are important for communicating Cochrane's unique identity to visitors and passersby, and they have been made a priority for communicating this. Everywhere outside of these 3 areas will be considered contemporary Cochrane. Construction won't fall under the framework, but there will be additional integrated neighborhood design guidelines or specific urban design guidelines for new master plan communities. The reason we're using this approach is we want to identify priority zones where we'll be able to direct our effort towards a high quality delivery of Western heritage will have the most impacts at both our local residents and potential visitors. So what does this look like in each of these three zones? In the historic town, the key ways we'll be delivering this is through its physical historic features, such as buildings, while interpreting both lost historic features and intangible historic scenes, and conserving and maintaining small town urban character through building design and public realm design. In the historic town, there are physical character defining elements that are well suited to tell the stories of early settlement era, like the small urban block plan and street grid. The lot fabric makes for small scale buildings and actual remaining buildings from that area. So this is a high priority place, and we want to target our efforts towards new building design that will conserve this small town historic feel. You'll also notice that we've gone from historic town, or from historic downtown to historic town. And we've extended this so that we're including some of the residential area to the east. Yes. The reality is Cochrane's current commercial downtown is a combination of retail storefronts and house form buildings that have been converted. Right. And this is going to continue to happen with non-residential development slowly moving east, especially along First Street, as well as some one-off neighborhood examples. So it's important to note at this point that this framework will be constrained to non-residential design. So even though that we have highlighted residential areas in this historic town, it will only apply to properties when they come in for a non-residential project. As mentioned, we have 7 high-level mandatory design objectives for the historic town, and they're split between private property owners and the public sector. When applicants come in with proposals, they will have to explicitly demonstrate how they're meeting each of these objectives. They can do this by relying on direction in the guidelines that we'll provide, but we also want to leave it open for creative interpretations to meet these objectives. As the development review team, so both administration and the planning commission, it'll be expected for us to use our judgment and discretion to determine if they successfully meet the objective. So when we review the guidelines, we're also looking at how it's going to help us as a team understand what the strategies are looking for. An example of how this might work, here's objective 1.2 that we just saw, as well as the supportive guideline. The objective asks that new buildings be compatible with nearby heritage buildings, because we know the heritage buildings are the baseline marker for our historic small town context. One of the guidelines helps us understand this, that one way to be compatible is by responding to the setbacks established by older construction. So on First Street, where most of the buildings have a 0 lot line setback, new construction will be required to as well. Conversely, if you move away from First Street, you encounter more residential type buildings, such as the Watermill Bakery. And we'll be looking for front and side yard setbacks consistent with those forms. This guideline helps us understand that maintaining a street rhythm is one of the ways to be consistent and supportive of historic small town character. Throughout the document, there will be precedent photos and sketches to accompany the guidelines, such as the one presented on this slide. The precedent photos will also help show that there may be many different creative ways to achieve a single objective. All right, and in the railway transition zone, the 3 key areas to conserve Western heritage are, again, conserving and maintaining physical and visual access to the railway, a key historic feature in Cochrane, as well as interpreting those lost historic features and intangible historic scenes in this area. And finally, we want to foster urban characters through building design and public realm design, as one of the main functions here is to transition from the historic town to the more contemporary downtown. So this railway transition zone exists as a buffer along the north and south of the railway corridor. And construction on each side on any of the properties will be subject to this zone. In the downtown, you can see that this extends to the north of First Street and the south of Railway Street. This means the south side of First Street is not the historic town. It's in the railway transit zone. And this is to be consistent with the historic development of Cochrane, where only the north side was really developed as a main street. Again, we've highlighted 7 objectives for the railway transition zone. They're very similar to the historic town, but you'll notice that there's no discussion about compatibility with heritage buildings in this zone. The idea is that these controls are intended to foster urban character, such as walkability, but otherwise the design of the buildings is up to the architect. And if you think of the context of First Street, this means that there'll still be a distinctive design approach to both the north and south side of the street. The north side is supposed to feel like a historic town, while the south side has been developed as a more contemporary urban place. This was intentional, and we'll get into that a bit later. Like the historic town, there are design objectives for both private and public sector. And this is because a big part of communicating the small town character is about public realm design. Similarly, interpretive installations to communicate historic scenes and stories are usually more effective when they're carried out by the public sector. The third area is Cochrane's corridors. And because there's no remnant of physical heritage features in this zone, Western heritage is going to be communicated by interpreting those lost historic features and intangible historic scenes. If you look at the map, you can see there are property lines that are touching these zones, and they're outlined in pink. And this is to show that, like the railway transition zone, if one of the properties falls within this zone, non-residential construction on the site will be governed by the framework. And we have only 2 key objectives for this zone, and they're both about interpretation. We ask private sector actors to contribute to the interpretation of Cochrane's heritage through one of 2 approaches outlined. We also ask ourselves to deliver and facilitate interpretation at key sites along the corridors. This is a different approach from how we've treated highway commercial in the past. And instead of regulating building design along the highways, we're asking for investment in interpretive media that will communicate to highway travelers that Cochrane is a special place to spend time. So this is like the Cochrane Ranch site or the Man of Vision statue, which will provide drivers with eye-catching landmarks that they later can remember about Cochrane. We'll get into more details of what this will look like later in the presentation. All right. We're also looked at the scope of the new Western Heritage Design Framework. As mentioned, this is only going to be for projects involving non-residential construction, so new buildings construction, alterations, additions, and only in the 3 zones that we've just discussed. There are 2 pieces that are going to complement this framework. A cash in lieu policy for the railway and highway zones that give an option to property owners to contribute their interpretation via cash to a town fund, rather than designing something specific on the site. As well as we're looking at a schematic framework or heritage interpretation plan, which will provide high-level strategies that are town-wide and identifying key targets for the delivery of interpretation, as well as important historic scenes that need to be delivered. These are important complementary steps to facilitate the use of interpretation as a central new method of communicating Cochrane's unique identity. Yeah. And if these seems like new big concepts and steps, we're going to go talk later in the presentation about why this is the ideal way to approach Cochrane's delivery of Western heritage. There are some things that are not going to be covered in this framework. So the existing historic buildings across Cochrane are already addressed by policies in our MVP and our current heritage program. Additionally, the maintenance of small town urban character throughout the new downtown in Ellsbury and Cochrane will be addressed through the land use bylaw update, as well as area structure plans and area redevelopment plans in these areas. As we found throughout public engagement, when residents express the desire for a small town urban character in Cochrane, it was less, there were times where it was less about communicating Cochrane's heritage and more about just simply having good streetscape planning and prioritizing walkability and smaller scale businesses. And finally, any new master plan communities are going to be covered by their own planning documents. As mentioned, they could be area structure plans, as well as our integrated neighborhood design guidelines. So where are we at right now? So as you may know, this process started about 2 years ago with the overall review of the land use bylaw. It was decided at that time that the Western Heritage Design Guidelines needed to be reviewed at the same time so we could bring them into conjunction with the new land use bylaw. And after some public engagement, as well as some stakeholder engagement with such as yourself, CPC, we engaged ERA to help us update the Western Heritage Design Guidelines. And we're now presenting these key updates to the framework before we get the document finalized, with the ultimate goal being that once the land use bylaw update is complete, it will fully incorporate this revised Western Heritage Design Framework. Okay, so that's the first half of the presentation. I know there's probably a lot of questions, but I want to dive into some of the key concepts that we're going to be updating. So these are the 6 concepts. I'll give you a moment to read it. However, the first one we are going to start with is the fact that the historic town's objectives and guidelines are intended to deliver more contemporary style buildings in the historic town. Just going to take a quick check. Okay, so you may remember when we looked at objective 1.2, and it asked new construction to be compatible with and responsive to heritage buildings. What we didn't get to see is one of the guidelines explicitly says that new buildings should be contemporary in style and not mimic early architectural styles. They should avoid creating a false sense of historic development. We have the supportive element in the guidelines so that when we're evaluating proposals under this objective, we as a development review team will understand that we're not looking for new buildings to pretend to be historic. We want architecture that's compatible and responsive, but not identical and indistinguishable. It should be clear that when people are in the downtown, they understand what is a historic building and what is not. These guidelines in particular, or the precedent photos and the graphics, will help us understand what that means. We're looking for contemporary building design with subtle references to the historical character, with like brick or wood materials, or other physical cues to help that new building fit in, like matching window heights or roof lines or to adjacent historic structures. And this is a pretty significant shift in our approach. And why are we asking this? And the answer is, when we look at heritage best practices, it directs us to distinguish between historic fabric and new construction. So it allows us to recognize what is authentic in our historic downtown, and so we can effectively celebrate it. This direction comes directly from Parks Canada's standards and guidelines for the conservation of historic places, which is the main federal document guiding best practices for heritage conservation across the country. And of the 13 key standards, Standard 11 speaks specifically to what we're supposed to do in this case: make new work physically and visually compatible with, subordinate to, and distinguishable from the historic place. And while this may sometimes reference in addition to historic building, we're looking at this as Cochrane's historic town as a historic place in itself. So when we want new work, such as new buildings or construction, it still needs to be distinguishable from that historic fabric. And this is a really important piece of the original goal, to bring our old guidelines up to best practices. As in many cases, we found that those guidelines were going contrary to these practices and what was being done in other jurisdictions. After I'm done my presentation, I'll be happy to discuss this further. if you have any questions, as well as ERA is available to speak to this idea specifically. Another key concept that we're changing is no direction on architectural style in the railway transition zone. What's now the railway transition zone was previously two sections, the north side of the railway in the historic downtown and the south side of the railway in the new downtown. And the guidelines offered stylistic direction for buildings in each of these areas. However, in the new framework, there'll be no direction. So windows should look like what, so nothing about what windows should look like or materials should look like or what your roof should look like. However, what we're asking for is that the design objectives speak about building form and ground floor design. And this is to follow the main goals of the railway transition zone, where people in the public are able to see the railway and for the zone to feel urban and walkable and transition pedestrians from businesses in the historic downtown to the new downtown. And when we talk about giving direction to the building form, it's asking buildings to be orientated or shaped to allow sightlines to the railway, as shown in the examples. And when we talk about ground floor design, it's the idea of having that animated facade, retail storefronts that are scaled in width and height to make pedestrians feel comfortable. Like I said, you can see a couple examples here of how this could be interpreted. Good. So even on the south side of First Street, it's still going to feel like a small-scale historic town, even if it doesn't have that same direction that we had before. And the reason for this is the same reason that we just talked about, the direction from the standards and guidelines, about being able to read and understand historical places. So for the first half century of Cochrane settlement, the main street character that we know only existed along the north side of First Street. You can see in these historical photos that the south side was predominantly empty except for a couple key buildings. And even a tree buffer was built there at one point, all right, to help offset the open space on either side of the railway. We, of course, are not proposing to go back to an empty, unbuilt environment there. We just want to distinguish that each side of First Street had a different history. And so just like it is today, the south side of First Street will be legible as a more modern place. All right, the third concept relates to our third zone, Cochrane's corridors, as there's no longer any direction on architectural style, and it even goes further to not give any direction on building design at all. We previously treated highway commercial as being expected to exhibit Western heritage style in its building. However, building design will now be left up to the property owners and architects' preference. We are doing this to move away from regulating building design and Cochrane's corridors. And the fact is that many of these businesses along our highways are typical for our sort of municipality across North America. Most of them are chain businesses, and most of them tend to be auto-focused or suburban in appearance. And we've received pushback on both sides for this one. A lot of pushback in our public engagement, where the appearance of these businesses made some residents feel like they are living in a suburban community, and it doesn't evoke that small town feel. However, at the same time, businesses push us back when we ask them to exhibit historical inspired architecture, as they want to have a recognizable, prominent logo and for their franchise that can identify them from afar. And generally that's what they're designed to do, as it is a highway business and it needs to be recognizable for travelers passing at speed. So our team started thinking about the goal of Western heritage, especially along Cochrane's corridors. And we returned to the fact that these corridors are about branding and about establishing place-making features and communication, and about Cochrane's unique identity to help people who are passing by. And if we weren't going to do this through building design, and that simply aimed to obscure the appearance of chain businesses. We had to find a better way to achieve this. We landed on a new method of communicating Western heritage to be implemented throughout all street zones, but primarily in Cochrane's corridors. And this is a method of heritage interpretation, where before Western heritage was only communicated through building design that invoked an early settlement era aesthetic. New Western heritage will be communicated through diverse media and installations to tell stories about Cochrane. And this will be achieved through all kinds of physical means, such as art installations, sculpture, like sculptures, murals, or inlays of imagery or words, or plaques and panels that show maybe a historic map of an industrial mining area. It can still be delivered through the building design, such as the proposed innovation building, which will be located in the railway transition zone. Even though it's clearly contemporary, it does interpret the railway heritage by having a truss bridge typology in its building frame. And there are even options to deliver interpretation through landscaping design, by paving public spaces and ways to tell stories, or designing new public spaces with various features to communicate a story. The one example being Calgary's Poppy Plaza along Memorial Drive. All of these physical features we see in the built environment can contribute in communicating the stories of a place's history and identity. And even in the previous slide, interpretive installations can be targeted specifically to their audiences. So the ones along Cochrane's corridors would be designed to be appreciated and understood by audiences moving in vehicles, like the Man of Vision statue or the Poppy Plaza signage along Memorial Drive. These installations show a historic house that reveals different perspectives as the audience moves by. The direction to deliver Western heritage through interpretation doesn't stop stakeholders from doing it through building design, but it gives them more options to how they can tell these stories creatively. And hopefully it will result in more high quality approaches. However, we also mentioned that in the railway transition zone and Cochrane's corridors, there would be an option for property owners to deliver this heritage interpretation through a cash in lieu contribution. Although the onus is still on private property owners to contribute, we're now allowing them to do so through a cash contribution. And this will go towards the town's public art or interpretation delivery, if that's their preference. And you may ask why we would allow this type of leeway. And as you can imagine, there would be many property owners that would opt for this route. So if we were negotiating with a big franchise to build a new location, it would be much easier for them to make this contribution rather than investing time and effort into making their brand fit to our specific parameters. And this isn't necessarily a problem. On this slide, we've taken an example of Highway 22 to demonstrate what this could look like if in two scenarios. One where property owners decided to do their own interpretation, well, if the town did their own interpretation in the public right of way. So on the left image, you can see each of these property owners has installed an installation, like the type we saw previously. It could be a bunch of sculptures, but they could all be communicating different historic themes in different ways, and they wouldn't necessarily have the same design intent. On the right, it imagines all but one property owner decided to make a cash in lieu contribution. So again, if that red dot is a sculpture, the town could maybe do a gateway feature along the highway marked in blue, or an interpretive mural to screen the schoolyard in turquoise. And there's also options for landscaping to emphasize ranch style along the highway, such as tall grass plantings and enhanced wood fencing. The benefit here is the town is driving these installations, and they can be installed at key public locations and take direction from town-wide interpretation strategy. They can feature a coherent design language, and they're guaranteed to be high quality. And it gives us opportunity where we can also engage local designers and artists to develop these special storytelling pieces. However, part of the cash and loop policy that needs to be developed still will address how much money is expected from these property owners, either towards their own installation or towards the town's funds. We wouldn't want someone who's not interested in delivering anything to avoid cash in lieu by simply installing the plaque and arguing that that's all that they need to meet requirements. So we're looking at options that will tie it to either the scale of the project, such as the cost of the building or the size of the site. The last major change in this framework is its open-ended and flexible nature. As mentioned many times, the guidelines were very direct and specific, and property owners understood that they were expected just to follow the rules. However, many times we found that it was not easy for new buildings to follow these rules. So we're now looking in this framework that the high-level intent of each of these 3 zones will be outlined in the objectives, but will still leave room for diverse approaches. The guidelines will help stakeholders such as public property owners or administration understand what the objectives are really talking about. Even if you don't follow the guidelines, though, there'll be opportunity to make a compelling argument that you're meeting the mandatory objectives. This approach could be considered less clear than the previous version, but it gives more leeway for property owners and developers to be creative. And it asks us, so administration and CPC, when we review development, to use our discretion and judgment in evaluating proposals. And the reason we're doing this is because we don't want all of our buildings to look the same, which seemed to be the goal of the previous guidelines. We want room for creativity and high quality architecture. We also want to provide guidelines to support property owners so that they may not need to rely on a sophisticated architect to design their work. And that's why the guidelines are in place. Here's an example of Objective 2.1 in the historic town. You can see the higher level objective leaves rooms for different approaches on the same lot. On the left side, you can see a more traditional building that is meeting this objective through matching front setbacks, horizontal datum lines across the historic building, having a traditional retail storefront at grade, and using Cochrane's historic buff brick. However, on the right side is a more contemporary building that also meets these objectives. Again, they match the front setback and those horizontal datum lines with the upper story windows. Even though the window pattern is a bit less traditional, and the buff brick has a more complex texture to it. This contemporary building meets the expectations for the historic town. Even though it doesn't feature a traditional arrangement, it's still animated at grade and it engages the pedestrian environment. And it is still a scale that is appropriate and not off-putting for the historic town. While we understand that most new construction in Cochrane isn't going to be designed by high-level architects, we want to leave room for innovation and creativity when opportunities arise. And we want those designers to feel excited about contributing to Cochrane's built environment and not simply constrained by regulations at every turn. So that is my presentation. We're now available for any questions you may have.
Okay, so I can't see anybody's reaction or questions. So I'm going to kick off and ask a number of questions, Adam, if that's okay.
Sure.
So when you talk about, on slide 12, you talked about small scale, close-knit building. I wondered about height. Is there going to be restrictions on height? First of all, thank you very much for your presentation. But looking at this one, so if I'm looking at the boxes here, the blue and the other colored boxes, they're all the same height. Is that intentional, or I'm just wondering, so if I'm in the heritage downtown, is there going to be rules and regulations with respect to height of buildings? Like, are we all of a sudden going to have an 8-story building in the middle of the heritage area? What are the thoughts there?
So that's part of how this objective talks to being responsive to those adjacent buildings. So they would need to look at the height of the heritage buildings nearby and provide something that's compatible. So it wouldn't necessarily allow them to do anything taller than those buildings surrounding them.
So sorry, they would not necessarily be able to be higher than or taller than? I'm just clarifying.
Adam, do you mind if I jump in for a sec?
Go
Is
for
that
it.
okay with the committee?
Go ahead.
Hi.
Was that Emma speaking? I've lost everybody's.
This is Emma from ERA. Hi, everyone. And I'm just going to jump in to share that this is one of those places where the zone or the land use bylaw is actually going to be working with the Western Heritage Design Guidelines. So the height restrictions in the historic downtown are going to be driven primarily by what's allowed from a land use planning perspective. And then to complement that, there's also a request to be compatible with and responsive to nearby heritage buildings. So if this committee or if administration is reviewing a proposal for an 8-story building, if that's something that's allowed under the land use bylaw, if you were to be reviewing a proposal for an 8-story building next to a 1-story historic building, and you wanted to say, you know, we don't believe that this is compatible or responsive, then that's the measure that you're using it against. I believe that there is a guideline that speaks specifically to responsiveness to height. So this is just one example of the guidelines under this objective. There are a number of other guidelines that help explain what this objective means. I'm pretty sure there's one about height. But your test is going to be, do we believe that this 8-story building is really compatible? And if you're saying no, then you have some text in the guideline to help support to the applicant why you're saying no.
Okay, thank you. So I have two kind of comments. So this is different, I think, than what I was seeing. So this is a different approach. When I was thinking of the heritage area per se, and this is my own input and questions, is that I thought that there would be an opportunity for the walker, the pedestrian, the driver in that area to see continuity and know that they are in a special area. So I guess my question is, knowing that we're looking at different creative ways, do you see the ability to retain that, to be able to retain that sense of place? This is where I am. I'm in a place that is different than if I was in a mall in Calgary or that I was in a strip mall somewhere else. My main concern, I think, here is to try to maintain, at least in the heritage area, that I've walked into someplace different. And I know that I have that different, and I can feel that difference as I walk through that whole area. So my question is with these new suggested guidelines, to what degree do you believe that we'll be able to retain that sense of I'm in a different place? Am I making sense?
Yes.
Emma?
Sure, I can speak to that. Or Adam, did you want to jump in?
Go for it.
Okay. I think that there are a lot.
Sorry, Emma, you're breaking up.
Existing built character. Sorry, I'll wait till my
Sorry,
internet
Emma,
tells me I'm
just
unstable.
start over. Yeah,
Okay.
start over
Am I-
because you
am
cut
I
out.
back?
Yeah,
Okay.
you're back.
So our
Okay.
sense from our visits was that there is a lot of existing built character in the historic downtown that is going, or the historic town that is gonna, that provides the basis for that special place, whether it's existing historic buildings or kind of there's like an urban sort of lot layout and grid layout that conveys this sense of a historic urban place that was designed before the 1950s, when sort of urban planning and urban design became much more suburban. And it's our sense that even if a new building is designed to look like a building that was built in the 2020s, that will be something that you're still able to read in the built environment, because you're walking along a sidewalk and you're seeing kind of smaller scale retail bays, like not big wide stretches of buildings. It's something you'll get to see through heights, and it's something you'll get to see through the fact that new construction is going to sort of materially be supportive of the older stuff. It's not gonna kind of be like loud and overshadowing it, but instead it's going to fit into the context so that it's sitting back and kind of letting the authentic original buildings kind of set the tone for that character. And then complementing that, the opportunity for public art and interpretation allows for both the town and, in theory, individual developers, but particularly the town, to kind of be telling this story along with the existing built fabric that's kind of setting that tone.
Okay, so a question I note in the presentation, there's reference to in quite a few places about small scale, close knit. So in the land use bylaw, will there be very specific guidelines with respect to size and buildings, and then going back to the height and those kinds of things? So this is please help. Do I have this? This is kind of an overarching framework, but it's not the land use or the specifics that would come out through the land use bylaw. Is that, do I have that correct, Adam? Or
Yes, yeah, there'll be specifics in the land use bylaw that's going to talk about the width of a development, the setbacks, the height. However, the guidelines will be there to support it in the historic town. And it should be noted that the land use bylaw will be taking those urban design guidelines, and they will be applying it to other areas as well, to make sure that even if you're in the historic town or in some of the more contemporary parts, it's still going to be walkable and feel like you're in, well, you're in your own neighborhood and you feel in place there.
Mm-hmm. So what is the proposed, or who will be the proposed development authority of these buildings on a go forward basis? So do you see
it will be split
or
sorry,
or will it be administration? Will it be CBC? How do you see that as on a go forward basis, deciding whether or not the design is something that we want to approve of?
So it will be split between administration and CPC, kind of how we already do our development reviews. In all cases, administration will be reviewing the application first. And then if it is for a discretionary use per se, that's when we would bring it to CPC, and they would also be able to conduct that review. So it is going to be supportive of all of our applications.
So, and those are not written yet. There's those, what is discretionary and what is not, with respect to the heritage guidelines, has not been outlined and brought forward.
To maybe clarify, it's going to be, so all applications will need to, if they're in these 3 zones, they will need to follow the guidelines. So even if it is a small addition that may go to administration, or if it's a new building with a discretionary use that goes to the Cochrane Planning Commission, that's all going to be decided within the land use bylaw itself. This is just outlining what the rules are going to be for these 3 zones.
Okay. I'm going to keep asking questions until somebody in the group chat says that they want to talk. Otherwise, I've got the floor. So if you go in the railroad area, I just want to make sure that I am clear now. So we have the south and the north of railway. So the proposed tri-site will not be part of or fall under the umbrella of the heritage downtown. Is that correct?
No, the only site that will fall under that area is the Innovation Center and Transit Hub.
Okay. So in your research, Emma and Shelley, who I've not given a chance to speak yet. So in the research, taking this approach, have you seen examples of communities that have, because what I heard from Adam and what I've seen from the results is getting pushback from the residents. The residents want to see it as a unique entity. And so do you see this as the ability to implement the concepts that you're presenting while keeping that? Because I think that that would be a key need or request or voice from the residents.
So I think that the big question that we have had is whether the thing that communicates Cochrane as a unique place is building design, and some of the ways that building design has been happening are and I'll just, speaking to this committee, I'll say that they're not really consistent with the best practices were in heritage work. So we're coming from a heritage architecture firm. And so our work is driven by, and we're sort of working across the country, and our work is driven by best practices in heritage conservation. And so the idea of communicating historic character and heritage value through kind of new building construction that doesn't make it easy for people in the public realm to distinguish between the new and old is really pretty antithetical to those principles. However, we think it's incredibly important that there are placemaking opportunities throughout Cochrane, both for people who are like locals who value their own heritage here, and so that people who are coming through can experience it. And it's our experience that some of like the most effective way to do that is through all these different forms of heritage interpretation. And that interpretation has the opportunity to, I'll stop there. I can explain.
Yeah, because it's interesting. I mean, it's very interesting to find a balance. I have so many questions coming up with respect to, I understand that there are companies, mostly car companies, that are national and want to preserve their brand across the country. And I fully understand that. I have a little bit of myself. I go a little bit, yes, but this is Cochrane and we want to make it and preserve Cochrane. I guess my question is, it's about making it almost a designation or a destination place, so that I guess I have a little fear right off the hop that if we put too much or give too much leeway, that there'll be a loss of the feeling of destination that we have come to Cochrane. So
can I interject?
Yes. Who is it? Oh, Heather. Yes, you may.
So first a comment. I think that the bottom line is with the bylaws and the levels, basically three different levels of for lack of a better word, public administrative intervention, right? I think that given those three different levels, we ultimately do still maintain some control over what happens in historic downtown versus new downtown versus the corridors. And I agree with just as a comment, I agree 100% with the idea that if we continue to limit and put such restrictions on buildings and looks and things like that, I think we are completely missing out on the opportunity to see new ideas. And because if somebody comes to me and says, you know, oh, what do you think Western heritage design is? Okay, I'm not an architect. I have a little design experience, but I'm not an architect, and I couldn't come up with 20 different ideas to say, this is it, right? But new businesses coming in will get us a slew of ideas, their contribution. They'll know how important it is to us because they'll know that they'll have to have approval on it. I also agree 100% with moving the decision-making on some of the decision-making pressure on some of the larger businesses in the corridors to the public, to administration, because you know, the question was coming up before of, well, what are they going to do to, what are they going to provide to, you know, continue our theme of Western heritage? And rather than they have the pressure or the additional work of coming up with those items, the cash in lieu is great, because then administration can have a team that is, it's their, you know, their goal and their responsibility collectively to present those stories throughout the 3 areas. Instead of, we would have a story that's being told instead of potentially a collage of different things, right? I think that that's a great direction moving forward. And I'd like to see if some of the private residential landowners along those, like up to 22 where the farmlands are and things like that, if those people could be included in that opportunity, that they could contribute, but we would, as an administration, would take lead on what kind of design goes there. Because there's a lot of opportunities there for us to attract visitors. And yeah, I think I just, it's a scary thing to open the door to the new ideas and such, but I think that if we don't, that we're missing a big opportunity on newer ideas. I also agree 100% that if we don't try to mimic completely the historical buildings that are in place, that still exist, then it will actually help them stand out more. And it'll also help us, I don't know the right words, but it would help us not look like we're being hokey, you know. We don't want to make historic Cochrane 10 times bigger, right? By just mimicking. We want to preserve that small historic area and make sure that that area is a place where people want to visit and people want to reside. That's all I have.
Thank you, Heather. I see that Erica would like to make a comment.
Hey, thanks. I think I was kind of along the same lines as you, Deb, and not expecting this, but I wholeheartedly, as I watched the presentation and thought about a couple places, I am really embracing it, because I think of Barkerville and I think of Winnipeg. Barkerville has historic houses. It makes sense for them to keep everything looking the same and historic. Winnipeg has a ton of historic original buildings, but the contemporary ones that have been built in the last 15 years, even though they're completely different, don't take away from the aspect of heritage down by the forks and things like that. But what I'm really intrigued with is the fact that the cash and lieu scenario, it's going to make our town attractive because of walkability, that we can have a historic tour. So we did this in Fort St. John as part of our tourism initiative, and we had plaques everywhere about history and like this building used to be here. Like the building doesn't exist anymore, but there's a nice plaque about it. And if you go in front of Ford here last fall, they did place a really beautiful bronze statue out front, and it does have a nice information plaque on it, and it's right off the side of the sidewalk. So if we can implement things like that and signs and more information and supporting hopefully local artists, because I know a lot of our bronze statues do, and we could reach out to more artists for murals and such. I think this town would really embrace that. My original town actually had a mural project for Canada 125. And so I'm just feeling like, yeah, you know what? This is a really good way forward.
Good. Okay, thank you, Erica. And I see that Lyle would like to make a comment.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Thanks, Adam. That was really informative and very thorough and very professional. I've learned to expect nothing less from you. I appreciate that. You answered most of my comments and questions in your presentation, but I do have two more questions, and then I have a couple of comments. And the first question is just a concern about, we've got a lot of local businesses who are really struggling right now, just trying to maintain solvency. And this is probably the last thing on their mind, is contributing to the Western Heritage design. And have you reached out to them, and have they been involved with input? And do you feel comfortable with their level of interaction with you?
So we do have a stakeholder group that I will be doing a presentation to later, the very same one, and it does involve some of our downtown business owners. However, for the most part, this document's going to be looking at new construction. So when these businesses come in if they're expanding their operations or building a new building, that's when we're going to start looking at this framework. All of the existing businesses right now, they don't need to worry about it. I know they have enough on their plate. But it's only going to be for the new businesses moving forward. So when there's redevelopment in our downtown, that's when we apply.
Thanks for that, but don't lose sight of the fact that as a business owner in town, you may end up competing with a building right beside you that didn't have to comply with the same requirements, and maybe putting you at a disadvantage. So I'm just asking you to keep that in mind. So, but it leads to my next question, and that is, the next most important group would probably be the development community. What sort of interaction have you had with them?
We do have some of our developers on our stakeholder group. So we will, again, I haven't had much interaction with them yet. CPC is going to be the first of 3 of the presentations I'm giving on this subject. So,
okay.
But they will be informed, and they will be aware for both in the contemporary downtown and in future developments what will be expected of them. Great.
So I do have 2 comments, and one of them is, although I believe wholeheartedly in the cash in lieu of and the financial contribution in lieu of that you referred to in slide 3.1, and I agree with the current CPC member comments on cash in lieu of, I am very concerned with those concepts. And the reason so is that in the last 3 years, I've seen that process used in the development community to escape either environmental responsibility or the responsibility to enhance the beauty of communities through ponds or trees. And it seems like an easy out. So what would solve that problem for me is that I don't understand the accounting process when somebody is taking what I consider the easy out with cash in lieu of. How do we account for that money? Does it just go into general revenue? If I felt that money really, we earmarked it, we combined it with 3 other cash in lieu of contributions, and we took that whole $75,000 and we built this plaque, I'd feel more comfortable. So that's something we'll take offline. I won't bore the rest of the group with that, but I just want to make it clear that cash in lieu of and financial compensation in lieu of is a concern for me. I love the concept. Yeah, in practice, it can be misused. Just one last comment quickly is, When you talk about corridor design, I think the process of breaking this into 3 was a good idea. I am a little concerned about corridor design. You did make a comment that some of it is difficult because we're reaching for recognition when people are traveling by at speed. And I'm not willing to totally accept that argument because the speed limits along, for example, 22 as it passes through Cochrane is 60 kilometers an hour. And my fear is born, or my concern is born from experience over and over and over again. If you think about, I love Las Vegas, but I don't want Cochrane to be Las Vegas. So when you put up a sign that allows a few more lumens than the last one, or this one's a little bit taller, or I need to have a certain fascia on the front of my business because I need to attract more business or I need to be recognized, suddenly your competition's got to up one you on that, and they got to add another 1,000 lumens. And so all I'm asking is for caution on letting that get away from us. I understand their point. I understand that they want recognition. McDonald's has made a fortune off their golden arches. But when you start letting people compete with bigger signs, moving signs, lit up signs, it gets away from us. So I'm asking just for caution. Thanks for taking my questions.
Yeah, and I'd just like to address those 2 comments quickly. Like I said, we're still trying to develop the cash and lose strategy, so I don't know what it will look like in the end. However, the basic form will be, we will have a measure of what's required to be contributed, and we'll look at it as what they need to contribute on site or what they need to contribute to the reserve fund. So other municipalities, say Calgary's public art funding, for example, they take 1% of the building's value. So, and that option is for either the developer to spend that 1% on their property or give it to the city. And that money goes into a special reserve fund that would be separately administered. And that's kind of the direction that we're looking at this time.
Great.
So it wouldn't interact with general revenue at all. It'd be
great.
separate administered by the town.
Just give you a quick
and as well as for the signs, we're going to be looking at that in the land use bylaw itself, and that's a better tool to regulate the height and brightness and location of them. In our guidelines, all it's asked is that it meet certain aesthetics. The old guidelines did actually specify anything about height and even lighting. It only speak briefly about not being backlit.
Does that answer your question, Lyle?
Yes.
Yes. Marnie, we haven't heard from you. Do you have a comment?
Yeah, I'm here. I do want to agree with some of the points that have been made. I mean, I love Erica's points about using local artists and stuff like that, because I think it is something that we've even pointed out, during council. Just, we need to sometimes get out of the way, and especially now with COVID, let's not make more difficulties for groups that want to come forward or that we could approach. Like, let's kind of cut some of those rules and regulations so that we are using local people to do our stuff. I like mostly about what's been presented so far. I don't necessarily have a huge problem with it. I would love to see some consistency through town, right? That's probably the main thing that I want to see through all the corridors, is just having consistency so that people aren't wondering what is going on from one neighborhood to another neighborhood. Let's kind of have consistent rulings so that when any business or anybody comes forward, development, business, anything, we actually know what we're saying and we're sticking to our word, rather than, I think that's probably the biggest frustration from anybody that I've heard, is that, well, what works for one doesn't work for the other, right? So let's just make sure that we're streamlined at this point with COVID. And when you look at the overall impact, I just want to say that this is not a 6-month delay or a year delay. We're talking probably a 5-year delay. Let's open up for businesses. Let's make sure that we are cutting as much red tape crap out of their way so that we can make sure that they are going to be successful here. I mean, you have to look at downtown Calgary right now, and how many businesses are now re-looking at, how can they function without having a headquarters? So it's not just the people that have decided now that they can't afford to pay their rent, but I can guarantee that you are going to be looking at a lot of businesses that are going to be looking behind the scenes to say, you know what? We don't need to have a lease space. We can actually function fully at home and through virtual meetings. And so we need to be ahead of that curve to making sure that whatever we can do to promote local business, support local business needs to be our biggest, point as we go forward. I mean, I don't want to hear of any more things shutting down right now. And unfortunately, we are going to hear of them, but let's try to minimize those risks and do what we can. And you know what? I do agree that local artists, they can add so much to our community. But again, let's not put up roadblocks so that they can't showcase their works here. I mean, that's probably my 2 cents about the whole thing.
Great, thank you so much, Marnie. So, I think you've heard from all of the members. Emma or Shelley, was there anything that you wanted to add?
I actually have been, I wanted to jump off something that Heather had said about, I can't remember exactly which comment of yours it was that sort of sparked this for me, but the idea that the cash in lieu allowance actually creates this opportunity for such kind of large scale interventions in theory that they can be sort of placemaking in and of themselves. Something that we were really struck by on our visits to Cochrane was the fact that when there are moments when you're driving up and down Highway 22 where like even with kind of the wood fencing and kind of tall grasses, or you're seeing a stormwater management pond and it kind of feels like rural and in theory like kind of ranch identity in a way that is not really it's not overt, but it conveys this sense of place that we thought was really different from a lot of the highway kind of highway character that we see in a lot of places. And that's something, even just like subtle landscaping, that's something that can be that can go a long way from a placemaking perspective. There's another, I think somewhere early in this project on our end, we were talking about this idea that there are these incredible opportunities for along First Street, and even something like a paving treatment of the road that creates a sense that this is a gathering place, is something that can mark the historic town as a sort of special small town character place where people come to gather. And we were talking about the idea that when there are businesses that are having difficulty in the historic town competing with kind of the larger big box businesses in the new downtown, placemaking interventions like that sort of make for programming or event space in the historic town are moves that can be made under that interpretation umbrella to bring people into the historic town. And this is all stuff that cash in lieu can be driving, in line with the idea of like a walking tour. These are, programming and events is just as interesting and just as much of an option as physical features.
Interesting, thank you. So do we have another comment? Erica, did you have an additional comment?
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly ask Adam, like, is this our final moment to give input, or is there other opportunity or public opportunity if other ideas pop up? Because I'm feeling my brain's just warming up.
I would ask if you had anything else to send it to me. This is going to be the last time that we're looking for input for sure, but there will be another opportunity to look at the document once it's finalized before we send it to council.
Okay, so process step, Adam, just for my own clarity, you said that there's a couple other stakeholder groups that you're meeting with. You're meeting with the downtown group, are you? And then with developers?
It's actually the same group. So early on, we set up a stakeholder group of all affected parties. So we had representatives from a couple of the developers, some of the key businesses in our downtown, as well as other interested organizations such as CHATS and the Stockman Memorial Fund. I'll be later this month, I'll be arranging probably another Zoom call with them where I'll be presenting this presentation again.
And so just to help me, so next steps, are you doing the presentation and then your step after that is?
Once we're done all the presentations, it will be finalizing the document.
And then presenting to council in the fall?
Hopefully over the summer, but the idea is that we're going to get it done before the land use bylaw.
I see. Okay. Well, I think this has been a great presentation, and echoing Erica, for me, a bit of new ideas, but it does present new opportunities also. So if no one else has anything else to comment, then we'll go on to, thank you very much, Adam. Thank you, Emma, and thank you, Shelley.
Have we captured our comments, Deb?
I don't know, Patrice, do you think you have?
I have captured some of your comments, and if you like, I can read back some of the things I've written down, but I think between myself and Adam that we will have captured everything.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah. Did you want to go over some of the ones that are very important to you? Did you want to recap those? And I'll just make sure that I have them here.
So just to clarify, you're going to read the ones that you've recapped, and then we can provide you input whether or not we think there's anything to add or missing?
Sure. Okay, so the first thing I wrote down, let me see here. So one of your concerns was about the land use bylaw guidelines, making sure that the setbacks and height would be regulated through the land use bylaw in the historic downtown. And then you had made mention about slide 12 in regards to the small scale close-knit buildings. That also had to do with the height restriction. Deb, you had mentioned that it was a different approach than what you were expecting, and you were wondering about the pedestrians, and would pedestrians see continued unity in the downtown area? And you wanted to make sure that they would, that the historic downtown would retain a sense of place and maintain the heritage, Western heritage guidelines or look. And then you also said, let me see here.
I think it's about a sense of feel, just that people will know. Yeah.
Feel. Yeah. Okay. You were wondering, I'm not sure who mentioned this, but somebody was wondering how, based on the research in taking this approach, how residents would respond to the heritage interpretation. And there was the comment about making sure that Cochrane remained a destination place, and that you didn't want to lose the feeling of destination that already exists in Cochrane. Okay. With the 3 different levels, will we still maintain control over what happens in the historic downtown? I guess that was more of a question. Okay, let's see. A couple of you had mentioned that you thought cash in lieu was a really good idea. And somebody had mentioned, I believe it was Heather, that private residential landowners be included in the opportunity to contribute on the main corridor areas, the 2 main corridors. And there was a really great comment about, I believe by Heather, that the older buildings in the historic downtown will stand out more if they're not all the same. So you were inviting more different and new architecture and design.
So I think one thing Patrice was kind of communicated through Heather and Erica was a sense of excitement about bringing creativity to the forefront and to allow people with ideas to bring forward that and to participate in bringing their, because we don't know what could be developed. And so
Creative contributions.
creative contributions. Thank you, Heather.
Thanks, Heather. Okay. Yes,
have-
and then you had brought up the using local artists to implement different forms of art, whether it be statues or paintings. Okay, what else do we have here?
I have some curiosity with respect to administration of this, and really going back to Marnie, not that we want to create a whole bunch of roadblocks, just how the cash in lieu would be administrated, who's the development authority, just questions, just detail. The devil.
Okay. There was concern about the corridor design or about bigger signs and competition among businesses on the two main corridors. Okay, and I got a couple of more things here. Okay, I think it was Marnie had said she agreed with using local artists. Let's not make things more difficulty for groups. She wanted to see consistency through town in all the corridors. Cut as much red tape out of the way to make things easier for local businesses. Stay ahead of the curve to support local business. Minimize risks for local business. What else? I think,
You know, this kind of comes back to a conversation previously that we've had about, you know, and I think it was Heather that mentioned it, you know, just about how Canmore's community or any of the communities bound for anything, just they have consistent signage, right? So I mean, I think that's the key, is that making sure that no matter what we're doing, geez, I'm not sure what happened there. It's probably my kids.
Is your house still standing?
Okay, nobody's on fire yet.
Good.
Anyways, but yeah, I just want to make sure that we are consistent in how we're dealing with, and that each community has something, whether or not how you tie it in. It doesn't have to necessarily be the same, but that there are consistent elements. Exactly. So that people know that no matter where they are in Cochrane, it is all the same messaging. Because I agree, I think that's part of the problem. You know, when you go from neighborhood to neighborhood, things start to fall apart and there's no consistency. So that is really what I love to see when we deal with guidelines, and whether or not it's an element of Western heritage or it's completely Western heritage, I don't really care, but I just want to know that everybody that knows that, no matter what community you go to, that they're all tied in together.
I think that the cash in lieu program and the idea that all of the design concept for the town period would be administratively led will help with that a lot. Versus one developer's idea versus another developer's idea versus, you know, I think that creating a pathway or driving the idea that administration has a interest and a leading hand in what's being presented.
Yeah, we just make sure that goes on beyond this year, beyond next year, beyond 4 years from now, right? So that it isn't something that is going to be changed versus, you know, the next council coming in, right? Because you have to remember that every time we have a switch of government, all of a sudden somebody else has a brand new idea, right? And I mean, that's not necessarily helpful. So I mean, God bless administration who kind of keeps us floating, but really I want to get us to the point where, you know, these pointers or these aspects that we're looking for in communities withstand a switch of government, because everybody's got new ideas and everybody comes to the table with something else, but it's confusing to developers, then it becomes confusing to government, and all in the end everything just becomes delayed and becomes a huge massive mess, and people in the community go, what the hell? I was expecting something completely different, right? So that is where I want us to develop something consistent that isn't necessarily lasting for a 4-year term. It's going to last longer.
Is there an opportunity to speak to that for a second?
Yes.
Emma. Adam had mentioned in the presentation on the slide about scope, like what's within the scope of this document, what's outside the scope. There was a mention of a heritage interpretation plan or thematic framework. And the opportunity for a heritage interpretation plan is really interesting because that's a really great moment to sort of define, based on like historical research and an understanding of all the different themes that are important to people in Cochrane, the themes that are valued. It's a really great moment to sort of identify key places across town that are sort of targeted areas for administration-led interpretive installations. So that's a moment to say, okay, like what are the gateways? What are the placemaking moments that we want to capture? And how will these sort of moments be tied together across the communities? What's nice about the cash in lieu toward an interpretation framework is that the interpretive pieces don't actually need to be installed in these 3 zones. They can
Yeah, and just to jump into Emma's description there of an interpretation plan, I mean, they also often include overarching themes and ideas so that it's not only necessarily guiding locations, but it's sort of setting that framework for what the big ideas are that you'd want to convey through interpretation. So Marnie, to your point, it would be, a standing document with these themes and ideas laid out that could be there on file, even if, government changes or when government changes. So, I mean, that's not something that we're sort of in talks yet with Adam and his team to do, but there's been kind of initial little teasers about it. Yeah.
Okay.
I know it's something that the heritage organizations like CHAPS and Stockman's are also, I think, would plug directly into, because they have that content, and that's sort of where the drivers could happen. And that's usually also complemented by like a robust level of public consultation to get people to like, not just what's on the existing historic record of valued heritage, but what people are saying today about when they think about Cochrane's heritage. Anyway, we digress.
Yeah.
Thank you, Emma. Patrice, were you finished? Did we cut you off?
Okay, I just included Marnie's last comment, develop consistency over a long period of time. And no, that was all I had, yeah.
I really like
one more thing, cash in lieu, large scale interventions, that was mentioned several times, so yeah.
I really like Marnie's idea of consistent signage throughout the town. That's one thing that I think would be very helpful and impactful. So just checking in with everyone, do we think that Patrice was able to capture all of our thoughts? I got a thumbs up from Lyle, a thumbs up from Heather.
Yep.
Erica, yes. Marnie? Yes, okay. So once again, I want to thank you all for your presentation today. Great work. And thank you all for that today. So moving on, the next item is number 6, a special meeting request. And are you speaking to that, Ryan?
Yes, I am. That's actually, there's no longer a request for a special CBC meeting to talk about zero lot line. When the agenda was created, we thought we maybe bring in the zero lot line bylaw to first reading on June 22nd, but we're not in a position to do that. So the zero lot line bylaw will come to CBC for comment on a regularly scheduled meeting, either July or August.
Okay. So do you have anything else that you want to add, Ryan? We do have a meeting on the 17th, do we not?
Yeah, so is the regularly scheduled meeting next week on Wednesday. at 6 p.m. Patrice will be getting the agenda package together today and emailed out tomorrow. And I don't have anything else to add to.
Okay, just to clarify, I said at 6, Patrice, or 6:30? Generally, they're at 6:30.
That's my mistake.
Generally, yeah, 6:30, isn't it?
30, okay. 6:30 on Wednesday, and that will be another Zoom call. We'll not be going back to the ranch house yet? Yes? Not yet? Okay. Well, I'd like.
Did you guys want to have the meeting earlier, or did you want to stick with the 6:30 time?
I think I need to stay with the 6:30.
Okay.
So,
I think that's better for me too.
okay, can I have a motion to adjourn the meeting, please?
I'll make the motion.
Okay, thank you. And we'll see you on Wednesday, the 16th at 6:30. Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Nice to meet you.
Thanks so much for having us. Yeah.
Thanks, everyone.